I call this meeting to order. So welcome to meeting number 69 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. We will start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. So pursuant to the order of reference of Friday, November 25th, 2022, the committee continues consideration of Bill C-20, an act establishing the Public Complaints and Review Commission and amending certain acts and statutory instruments. We have today two panels of witnesses. In the first hour, we have in person with the National Police Federation, Mr. Brian Sauvé, President. And with us today by video conference, we have as an individual, Heather Campbell, Calgary Police Commissioner, Customs and Immigration Unit, Mark Weber, National President. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. So welcome to all of you, and I now invite Mr. Sauvé to make an opening statement. 5 minutes, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, and thank you for having us. My name is Brian Sauvé. I'm the President of the National Police Federation, the certified bargaining agent for members of the RCMP. Civilian oversight of law enforcement is essential for ensuring public trust and confidence. With nearly 20,000 members of the RCMP handling over 3 million documented interactions each year, complaints can be expected. An independent, timely, and transparent complaints process is essential. To that end, the NPF believes that Bill C-20 presents the government with an opportunity to improve oversight and complaints processes across the RCMP and the CBSA. Bill C-20 offers an opportunity to address the issue of the police investigating the police and to make the PCRC a fully independent public complaints body. Amending this bill would meet the government's numerous and consistent mandate commitments and address the public interest in increased civilian oversight and transparency of law enforcement. To that end, the NPF is making the following 3 recommendations. First, the PCRC should end the practice of police investigating the police. Under the current CRCC model, members of the RCMP are tasked with investigating most of the public complaints filed. It has been noted many times that our members handle these investigations of their colleagues in a professional and impartial manner. However, this does create a perception of bias and possible conflict of interest. Independent civilian oversight of law enforcement is a critical component of bolstering public and member trust, which the NPF supports. The current system is not fully independent and does not serve to reinforce the government's intent to build public trust and oversight of law enforcement. While there are many advantages to having police investigating the police, many provincial public complaints bodies have utilized a hybrid investigative model. This model includes the involvement of civilian investigators in the investigative process, with some reliance on experienced police investigators either retired or serving. Second, the PCRC should be appropriately resourced to conduct its own investigations, having the authority to make independent decisions and recommendations that are not politically motivated. Currently, the CRCC receives an average of 3,500 public complaints per year. However, most are not investigated as they are deemed frivolous, vexatious, or out of time. Estimating an average of 1,500 files per year that require a 40-hour investigation each, we're talking about approximately 60,000 work hours taken from communities where our members could be engaging in core policing duties. That equates to about 30 full-time RCMP officers, and unfortunately, there is no cost recovery mechanism for those communities to regain those hours. Bill C-20 should be amended to allow the PCRC to conduct its own investigations, using and hiring its own investigators, and stop the downloading onto other resources. Failing this, if members of the RCMP are to continue to conduct investigations, there must be a cost recovery mechanism established to compensate for the countless hours in overtime our members are spending conducting public complaints investigations that take them away from their core policing duties. This is particularly harmful in smaller detachment areas where all resources are vital to daily operations. Third, the PCRC, with the addition of the CBSA, needs an increase in funding and staff. The CBSA will create an influx of new complaints, and more resources will be needed to keep pace. The estimated increase in public complaints further emphasizes the need for the PCRC to be established as a truly independent body that is effectively resourced to complete investigations through the hiring of their own investigators similar to provincial public complaint bodies. To be effective, the government must enact changes to Bill C-20 to address concerns about transparent, fair, and timely investigations while also ensuring that public interest is being met. These changes must strengthen the ability of the PCRC to be fully independent, to conduct evidence-based investigations, away from any political agenda of the day, while ensuring it is fully resourced to act and conduct its own investigations. Thank you, and subject to any questions.
Thank you, sir. We'll go now to Ms. Campbell. Please go ahead, 5 minutes. I understand your internet connection is somewhat unstable. We will, if you need to slow down for that, we will try and make adjustments as well. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I appreciate the invitation to appear as a witness to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. Although I am a commissioner with the Calgary Police Commission, my testimony today is provided as an individual. My comments are exclusively my own and not those of the Calgary Police Commission. My name is Heather Campbell, and in my work in my life, I come to you from Calgary, Mohkinstsis, where I live as a guest on the traditional Indigenous lands of Treaty 7 and Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I'll prioritize my comments to countering racism, and systemic bias in policing in this presentation. I will address data collection, data management, and data sharing in policing, particularly the need for demographically segmented data in complaints and in all areas of policing in the question and answer period, time permitting. Policing in North America has been, from its creation, deeply rooted in racism. When it comes to police reform, it isn't bad apples, it isn't a bad barrel, it is literally the soil. Success in police reform will only come when bravely and transparently the culture and environment, the soil, is modified such that it poisons the landscape for racism and systemic racism to flourish in policing. A detailed plan for the transformation of the culture of a police service that has systemic racism within its walls and ranks is required. Cultural transformation is not an overnight action. It took 2.5 years for the existence of systemic racism in policing to be accepted and understood by a majority of the police service in Calgary. There are still those who rail against it, and I often personally receive backlash when I identify or note a relapse in the progress made towards anti-racist behaviors. One of the most challenging things in my life was reading the 109-page report called Missing and Missed. The report, prepared for the Toronto Police Services Board, was largely prompted by concerns that the MacArthur-related investigations in Toronto and Peel region were damaged by systemic bias. Many community members felt that the Toronto Police remained uninterested in the disappearances of MacArthur's victims until Mr. Andrew Kinsman, who was not a person of color, was reported missing. The review of these cases take into account the presence and impact of systemic bias, discrimination, and differential treatment by Toronto Police, and in the investigation of missing persons. The Honorable Justice Gloria Epstein, in her executive summary, wrote that, quote, "The disappearance of MacArthur's murder victims were often given less attention or priority than the cases deserved," end quote. I will be far more direct and plain spoken than Justice Epstein. They were brown and they were black, they were gay and they were trans, and when they went missing and were eventually murdered, the police didn't look that hard for them. Accordingly, there should be dedicated resources and resource planning to provide critical attention to missing persons investigations, particularly for cases involving missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit persons. A substantial finding in the mass casualty report from Nova Scotia was that, quote, the perpetrator's pattern of violent and intimidating behavior was facilitated by the power and privilege he experienced as a white man with professional status and substantial means, end quote. Systemic bias in policing favored a privileged perpetrator despite a wealth of red flags that had been reported to the police by members of marginalized communities. A cisgender, white, male, middle-aged, privileged denturist murdered 22 people, and police missed the signs partially because of systemic bias. The transformation and cultural change to nullify the training and thinking that contributed to that error is the incredible challenge ahead of a civilian oversight body. Consideration must be made for the investigative skills and tools of the complaints investigations teams and professional standards teams. Do the investigators have the skills to investigate a case where the only complaint is racism? Have the investigators themselves rid themselves of historic systemic biases and inherent discrimination to evaluate evidence of racism and white supremacy in a case or complaint? Training and skills improvement may be required, and the investigators need to be open and receptive to the training and new skills that are focused on reduction of bias. Establish the Complaint and Review Commission so that it has an opportunity for success. Complaints and management of complaints are invariably about justice. Justice is more than policing. And if that principle is forgotten in this legislative exercise, there will be a continuation of the rallying cry from Canadian streets: no justice, no peace. Thank you.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Weber. Go ahead, please. 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you here today. As the National President of the Customs and Immigration Union, which represents Canada's frontline border officers and other personnel working for the Canada Border Services Agency, it is always a pleasure to assist this committee. Regarding the proposed legislation, we do have a number of concerns that I'd like to highlight. Acknowledging the type of civilian oversight the bill aims to create is something that already exists for most law enforcement bodies, and that we agree that it is paramount for our government and its agencies to develop the tools and recourses necessary to address issues linked to overreach, systemic discrimination, and abuse of authority. With that said, the bill seems to be missing the mark when it comes to addressing systemic issues already present within the agency, which is infamous amongst its employees for letting gross abuse by management run unchecked. To be candid, I've lost count of the number of times CBSA management has, in one way or another, done everything in its power to minimize, delay, or brush aside complaints from employees regarding highly problematic behavior from managers, choosing rather to use the robust discipline process already in place to punish employees through unfair and heavy-handed disciplinary actions. I see nothing in this bill that will help curb this, and I'm concerned that the proposed commission will mostly serve as an additional punitive tool to be used toward our public-facing members without really addressing entrenched cultural issues within the CBSA and its management structure. What we're talking about here is an agency that year after year refuses to hire an appropriate number of frontline officers, preferring to invest in automated technology, which when it fails, and it does fail, only exasperates existing issues. Automated technology that makes Canada less safe. It is an agency that claims to be committed to addressing systemic racism, but arbitrarily cancels anti-racism and anti-discrimination training developed in large part by its own racialized employees. It is an agency that does everything it can to set itself up for human rights complaints by staffing immigration holding facilities with poorly trained, contracted out security guards. All of these aspects play an underlying role in any complaint made to the Commission, and they must be addressed. We also have real concerns with the absence of clear language around an employee's right to procedural fairness and natural justice, to representation during administrative investigations, and around the time limits for investigations as well. In our experience, investigations within CBSA are already lengthy, more often than not unnecessarily so. Bill C-20 does not address this. In fact, under this new legislation, it's likely investigations could take years to be completed, which is neither fair for the complainant nor the party under investigation. I should point out that this bill is being discussed while more than 8,000 officers and other law enforcement personnel we represent at the CBSA are currently in bargaining with the agency and with Treasury Board. It is concerning that the Government of Canada would seek to pass legislation that could potentially change the nature of employment for our members, which would effectively bypass the bargaining process. At the very least, the union should be afforded the opportunity to address the proposed legislation and its ramifications at the bargaining table. Ultimately, the legislation should also include clear language guaranteeing that collective agreement rights are maintained, especially when it comes to investigations and representation. I'd like to end by pointing out that for many of our members, this latest piece of legislation is likely to be seen as yet another example of the agency and the government treating its border officers as proper law enforcement and public safety personnel only when it suits them. The role of border officer has changed tremendously over the past 25 years, and our law enforcement members are an integral part of this country's public safety framework. The proposed legislation of this new civilian oversight body implies that the federal government agrees, and yet our members are not recognized as public safety personnel under major public service legislation, such as the Public Service Superannuation Act and the Income Tax Act and their associated regulations. The government cannot pick and choose. For Bill C-20 to be coherent, it must be accompanied by language confirming the status of border officers as public safety personnel across federal legislation. Changes to these two acts must happen as well. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. We'll start now our questions with Ms. Dancho. Ms. Dancho, please go ahead. 6 minutes. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony and for being with us today. First question for Mr. Sauvé. And again, for those who aren't familiar, you represent the frontline RCMP officers across the country and others in the RCMP. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes, we're below the rank of inspector.
Thank you very much. And I did want to build on some of the remarks you had regarding sort of the independent model that your organization is looking for to further support, I would say, from my interpretation of what you've said, RCMP officers. And I know in discussions that we've had, and certainly upon reviewing the policy paper you've put forward on this bill, it would seem that provincial models like CERT in Nova Scotia, ACERT in Alberta, and I believe every province has a similar independent body that's triggered when officers use lethal force or other serious circumstances. And my understanding is those are completely independent bodies where we don't have officers investigating each other. Rather, it's a fully independently funded and independent individuals who come in and investigate those serious situations. Is that a correct assessment of the provincial investigation model?
Sort of.
Sort of, okay.
So, CERT, for example, Nova Scotia, ACERT in Alberta, they actually do the hybrid model where they will second serving police officers to work for a time period within and work alongside civilians. The IIO in BC is a fully independent civilian body with no police officers in it.
Okay, so some of the provincial models utilize some resources of frontline officers, but for the most part, they're independently funded. Is that correct? So it's not taking budgets from the police resource. Is that correct? Or part
yes,
of the budget?
Provincially funded,
okay.
yeah.
Understood. Okay, so in your remarks, you've sort of argued in favor of more of that independent model that you see provincially, whether it's hybrid or completely independent, depending on the province. If you were to design C-20, that's what you would be looking for with a new oversight body to sort of remove that officer investigating an officer model. Is that correct?
100%.
Okay. And I would imagine, now having not been a police officer, but I would imagine that particularly in a small detachment, officers investigating each other, they work quite closely together. Often there's a lot of camaraderie. And you've mentioned that there could be sort of a perceived conflict, but that's a concern. But also a concern I find is just what it does to morale to have officers investigating each other. Would you agree that there's an impact on morale in that regard?
Well, I'll reiterate, they do it very well. and it's
Of
been
course.
well documented that they do it extremely well. But yes, there is an impact to morale, and obviously it's an added burden to what they're already doing.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that, and certainly it's something that the committee should be looking at and taking seriously. So thank you for your testimony. I'm going to go to Mr. Weber with the CBSA. I am concerned on a number of fronts. I appreciate your remarks, and over the last 8 years, we know that the current government has only added an additional about 25 officers, frontline officers, to the CBSA. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And that's at a time that your mandate has been growing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and of course there's significant public pressure, and I'm sure pressure from government to crack down on gun smuggling. And I know the current government has announced resources for that, but I was surprised to learn that, in fact, really not very few frontline officers have been hired. So I am interested to know, I do get the sense that there are certainly, I've crossed through the border, folks sometimes get upset when border officers have to seize their goods. I'm just wondering what impact that has on officers. There must be a significant number of complaints, but how does that work when you're an officer? Do you have to go on leave without pay, or how does that logistically work?
Yeah, so I mean, at the CBSA, you're absolutely correct. Our frontline numbers are not nearly what we need. We'd estimate we need between 2,000 and 3,000 additional officers on the front line. In the time you described, we've added about 2,000 middle managers to the CBSA. Seems to be the only section that is growing. Our officers are exhausted, under incredible stress. We have summer action plans that have mandatory overtime. With the amount of leave that we can take is limited. Many officers do resort to leave without pay just to get some time off. And then, of course, when you look at the lineups and the volumes that we're dealing with and talking about what's being proposed under Bill C-20, with travelers waiting sometimes 2-3 hours to get to an officer, I mean, we are dealing more and more with people who are arriving to us furious, which is the baseline of what we have to deal with quite often when travelers finally do get to us. The solutions being proposed by the CBSA are automated kiosks and e-gates and things that, I mean, in terms of public safety are scary in our opinion, and really have done nothing to alleviate the backlog. We're desperate to get more people working at the border on the front line.
Thank you very much. And just with my remaining minute, just to, I think everyone agreed in their opening remarks that the oversight is very, very important. Certainly the frontline officers in both the RCMP and CBSA, we know, wield considerable authority, so it's important that the oversight is there. However, I was concerned to learn in my discussions with you that very often when these investigations happen, which sometimes are serious and sometimes can be frivolous and vexatious, I think is the word that Mr. Sauvé used in the RCMP context, that often officers are going up to a year without pay, and in order to get that pay back, they have to file a grievance. Like if the complaint is unfounded, can you just update the committee if that is that an accurate description that I provided there, and what should be done about that? It just seems very unfair if it's unfounded and they miss a year of pay. I don't know a lot of folks that can go a year without a paycheck.
Sadly, that is the process, yes. At the CBSA, it's the Security and Professional Standards Directorate who investigate more serious cases. If it's deemed that the allegation is serious enough, what will happen is that the officer's security clearance is pulled, meaning they're not suspended, they're not fired, they just cannot come into work until the investigation has completed, which could sometimes take a year or more, meaning they're not getting paid. They're essentially at home on leave without pay until the investigation is done. When it is found that when the allegations are not founded and it's found that there was no wrongdoing, we're told to file a grievance to recuperate the lost salary. It's devastating to people. You're right. I really don't know anyone who could go a year with no pay.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Ms. Nacho. We'll go now to Mr. Nur Mohammed. Go ahead, please. 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. I want to just begin by kind of digging into something that all three of you have touched on in different ways, and that is the importance of oversight. And I'd like to start, Mr. Weber, with you, if I might. One of the concerns that has been raised repeatedly is that there is very, very limited recourse when it comes to complaints against people's experiences at CBSA. We've heard this from racialized communities. We've heard this from the Muslim community quite widely. one of the things that I really would like for us to be able to do in this conversation is, of course, we acknowledge all the challenges. I want to be clear. We acknowledge the challenges of needing more people, and this is something that we do need to address. And I think we all accept that. So with that baseline in mind, I'd like to hear from you what your understanding is of the nature of these complaints and how you think best people should feel confident that there is recourse for these individuals who have these challenges when they are interacting with certain folks at CBSA.
Thank you. Yes. So I think, what Bill C-20 is proposing is important, and an oversight body is not something that the union is against. And I think the data that's looking at being collected is very important. Our concern is that the data be used to address systemic issues, that it be used to provide officers training, that it be used to make real change, and that it not be used simply that we found an officer who acted inappropriately and we've suspended him for 5 days and then that's the end of it. It takes real change, and we see it. I mean, we acknowledge that there are issues. Racism exists everywhere. It's something that we need to combat. It's something that we need to work on. But to make real change, it has to be holistic.
Thank you. So, Ms. Campbell, I'm going to turn to you. You sit on one of these oversight bodies, and
That's correct.
You've just heard Mr. Weber's comments, which I think are very important. I think what he talks about in terms of making real change is critical to us getting all of this right. In the time that you've spent in Calgary on that oversight body, what have been some of the things that you have learned that might be helpful to us in informing how we respond to some of the concerns that have been raised by Mr. Weber, but also I think in terms of how communities would feel confident that we're getting to a good outcome on this in terms of appropriate oversight and dealing with the real change and addressing the systemic issues that many people feel exist in the RCMP and the CBSA.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nur Mohammed. To maybe where I'll switch to our comments around data and data sharing, because that's fundamentally one of the things that's actually articulated in Bill C-20, but it's a transformational requirement that needs to happen. The mass casualty report, in one of the many lessons learned, indicated that there needed to be a naming and countering of the operation of misogyny, racism, homophobia, and other inegalitarian attitudes within policing. And that needs to be placed at the heart of the strategies to improve everyday policing. That's what I think Mr. Weber was reflecting to, was indicating with respect to real change. To improve everyday policing in an effective way, you need good data. You need demographically segmented data, and you need to be brave enough to actually address the challenges when you have that demographically segmented data. In Calgary, the racial demographics are wonderfully and increasingly diverse. Calgary is approaching 44% people of color in the most recent data. Realistically, the term visible minority won't make statistical or mathematical sense in less than 3 years, but it's still used in data collection and in policing. And frankly, no one wants to be called that fairly terrible, archaic, and socially diminishing term. Training and approaches need to be developed to train police services in the collection of demographically disaggregated data in a credible and consistent fashion. It's police, after all, who actually need to ask people in Canada for that information. Data collection currently occurs using a method called officer perception. So basically, where the presenting police service member decides based on their lived experience and knowledge, or lack thereof, quite frankly, a person's demographic characteristics for collection. Data collection processes and approaches need to be established for credible data collection, consistent data collection, and national data collection across Canada. Collected data must be analyzed with effective interpretation. Policing bodies need to be accountable for addressing the results, and that the analysis demonstrates within a defined time frame. We can't have this ongoing, well, we've learned this, and 3 years later there's another report and we've still learned this and nothing has happened. When Toronto Police Service was required to collect race-based data by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, those data merely reflected what, in certain cases, Black people have said and known for decades. The finding of note in the Toronto report was the section on use of force. Here, Black people were 2.3 times more likely than white people to have firearms pointed at them by the police when no other weapons were perceived. Longer. Okay. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Noor Mohamed. On y va maintenant, Madame Michaud.
Mrs. Michaud, 6 minutes. Thank you, and thank you to the witnesses for your presence. We're at the very beginning of our study of Bill C-20, and I'm trying to understand all the details. Mr. Sauvé, you made 3 concrete recommendations, and thank you for that. First of all, you said that we had to end the situation where police is investigating the police, and I'm trying to understand how the new commission will work. And so if I'm looking at the legislative summary prepared by the staff, we're told that there would be 2 possibilities, either to table the complaint with the RCMP or the CBSA or directly with the commission. And so when it says who will be on the commission, we're talking about civilians who never worked within the RCMP or CBSA. So I'm wondering, with C-20, are we ending the situation where you have officers investigating officers, or is there still work to be done?
I think as tabled, there's still work to be done. Hence why we are making some recommendations. And if you see in our submission, we've got sections within the RCMP Act that presently, so when the Commission receives a complaint, it expressly states that it will be downloaded to the RCMP to investigate. The RCMP will investigate and report back to the complainant and the Commission. Those should be amended if we're going to end the practice of the RCMP investigating the RCMP when it comes to public complaints under this new act.
Donc, si je vous comprends bien,
So if I understand, the complainant should not have the opportunity to send this directly to the RCMP. It should be sent to the new commission. Is that correct?
I don't think a member of the public, we should encourage the wide scope of abilities to file complaints, whether it be online at your local detachment, even at your local border crossing, or through the mail to the CRCC. However, once that complaint is received, how is it actioned is where we have to go, make modifications.
je vous remercie.
Thank you. You made a recommendation on funding and necessary resources. We're talking here about tens of millions of dollars for the first 6 years for the implementation of the commission. It looks as like the funding of the CCETP. I know that. Do you think that with the money that is being suggested, do you think that it's a sufficient amount of money to deal with all these complaints? Do you think that people will be facing prolonged delays? Do you think there will be a heavy and lengthy process that will make it so that people will just let go of their complaints?
And if you look at the process as it exists today, obviously, once a complaint is received and sent for investigation. There's a general ballpark figure there of about 60,000 man-hours or person-hours that are used to investigate those. Most of those are done within the 30-day statutory time frame, referred back to the CRCC and the complainant. Out of those, there's about 300 to 320 where the complainant may ask for review and further investigation. That comes back to the RCMP. If they're not satisfied, then the chair of the CRCC can institute a further investigation, and that happens in about 100 to 150 of those files annually. That's when they have their dedicated staff of about 80 or 85 across the country that take on the file. So I don't think the amount proposed is enough, and I don't know how much it should be, but we're just bringing it up and saying, warning bells. We have seen numerous civilian oversight bodies across the country that have tried to operate on a wing and a prayer, and they end up with considerable delays, which is not good for the public, it's not good for the member of the agency, and it's not good for civilian oversight generally.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Weber, thank you very much for testifying, and thank you for your comments in the media and earlier today. You were saying that oftentimes there are problems that go deeper. You were talking about systemic ethical issues, and that it's a shame that an officer that would be subject to a complaint would be reprimanded if the problem is coming from higher above. Could you speak to this and explain to us how we should deal with this issue? How should C20 deal with these systemic issues that might involve more than just the officer that would be the object of the complaint?
Thank you. I do believe what we need is an overall culture change. I think we need more education. We need more than just identifying one bad actor and disciplining them for X number of days and then moving on as though that has corrected anything. I think the CBSA as a whole and in upper management, especially, the culture has to change. As a union, we've brought forward, numerous really disturbing complaints about managerial behavior, and we may as well have not. It disappears. Essentially, if you're a manager and a complaint goes in, absolutely nothing is happening. We have an example of a chief of operations in 2011 that ordered the strip search of a busload full of students after the officers had released them and were confident that they were clear to go. Discipline, none. That's one case, and I could think of many that are much worse than that. Simply nothing happens. So that has to change. I think giving officers the ability to use C20 to bring issues forward that they see every day is something that under the current proposal is not there. We cannot use the process to bring forward concerns that we have and the events that we've witnessed. I think that would make a big change. And then overall, mismanaged policies, application of policies, again, the staffing level, those are all things that are not the officer's fault. That's a culture, and that's upper management at the CBSA. And again, when we're dealing only with complaints coming in with the public, well, the public interacts with the officer, who is the one who's there when they've been waiting 3 hours to get to the border to finally make their declaration, who, like I said, arrive quite furious. Our officers, again, are, I think it's overall, I could call it a mental health crisis. They are exhausted. They are working almost unlimited overtime with no ability to get leave. The summer is going to be even worse as we go through it. And this happened last year and the year before. And I don't see any kind of help coming. Our numbers never go up. So it's a desperate situation. It takes overall cultural and a total change within the agency.
Thank you. Merci, madame. We go now to Mr. Julian. Go ahead, please, sir. 6 minutes.
Thanks to all of our witnesses for very rich testimony. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Weber. Two things. First off, you've very clearly identified that in Bill C-20, implicitly, CBSA employees are recognized as public safety officers. What are the other things that the government should be doing to fully recognize CBSA border officers as public safety officers? What are the changes to the Public Service Annuation Act, regulatory changes, any changes to the Income Tax Act that would actually clarify this so that we no longer have this weird situation where the federal government pretends border officers are not public safety officers in some circumstances, and in others acknowledges that. That's my first question. My second question, I think you've been very eloquent in saying that you support C20's aspect of having CBSA employees accountable, but what I hear you saying is that CBSA management is not accountable, and that is fundamental to putting in place civilian oversight in a way that allows a systemic reform that is what I think we're all looking for. What are the changes to C20 that would actually ensure, what are the changes we could bring that would actually make sure that CBSA management is accountable for their actions?
Thank you. So I'll take the first question first. Legislatively, the two things that would have to change, number one would be the Public Service Superannuation Act. Border officers would have to be added as an occupational group, as exists for all other occupational groups, including corrections officers. That would have to change. The associated regulations would have to change accordingly as well. The second piece of legislation would be the Income Tax Act regulations. There we would have to start including FB members in the definition of public safety occupations. Those two things would go a long way and would solidify and codify that we are indeed public safety officers. In terms of things that would have to change in the proposed C20 to bring about real cultural change, again, which I think for CIU would be the goal, is an ability for CBSA officers to use the process as well to bring forward incidences and things that they know to bring about that kind of change, that those can be investigated as well through the process. We work in the milieu all day. We're likely to see a lot more than a traveler who's coming through whose interaction with the CBSA might be 10 seconds. Right now, that door is shut to us the way it's currently defined. And I think, again, a way to ensure that that is followed up on historically at the CBSA, the higher you go in rank, the less accountability that there always is, to the point where, I mean, we're very confident in many of the things we bring forward regarding managerial behavior, where I will say, I mean, if this was one of my members, I would be advising them, you're probably going to be fired. And there's no follow-up, absolutely nothing happens in general. It is frustrating at our level to see that happen. And again, change has to come from above. I would really like to see us be able to use what's available to the public here.
Thank you very much, and thank you to your members for their service to the country. Mr. Sauvé, you've been incredibly detailed, much more than the minister was, in terms of what are the resources that are actually required. 60,000 work hours. Is that including the 300 appeals or a sort of secondary look and the 150 that you identified currently that are cases that are looked into more specifically, and if it doesn't, we're talking about an even greater imposition on the work hours. By what factor do you think the government has missed the boat in terms of applying resources? If $19.4 million is not sufficient, is it 38 or 40 million? Is it 50 million? Do you have a ballpark in terms of actually putting this off, setting this commission up in a way that it can actually adequately doing the job instead of, as you so eloquently put, basically taking resources out of community policing?
So no, when I speak about 60,000 person hours to investigate those 1,500 complaints as a ballpark, that is just the initial 30-day investigation, returning it to the CRCC and the complainant. Should there be more required, that's not included in there. If we're only talking about status quo today, 30 members of the RCMP, it's about, all in, it's about $202,000 per member, training, everything, all that great stuff. So you can do the math. 30 times 200,000 comes, I'm going to guess here, quick math, 6 million-ish, or is it 60? How many zeros there? So that would be an estimate of status quo, just the RCMP. But when you add on a completely new public safety agency into the complaints process, I don't think anyone really has an idea of what that is going to do to the PCRC in volume through the next year. So how much volume are we going to see through the Canadian public? Is it going to be consistent with what's been with the RCMP, and how do you resource it appropriately?
But what you're saying is this is seriously under-resourced, given the figures that you've given us. The government is basically shortchanging this commission right at the get-go.
I would say yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you,
That's
Mr.
a very
Julian.
important point. Thank you.
We'll start our second round. This round is going to have to be abbreviated. We will end after Mr. Julian on the next round. Mr. Julian gets a hammer all the time. Mr. Motz, if you please, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. I'm just going to carry on with both Mr. Weber and Mr. Sauvé on what Mr. Julian was talking about. I have serious concerns with the current proposal, with resources, given how this legislation is written and how it's going to be proposed to look after both the RCMP and the CBSA. My guess would be that what is being proposed for resources for the PCRC, just for the RCMP, is insufficient, and you haven't even included the RCMP or the CBSA yet. That's a huge red flag for me. While I support wholeheartedly the idea of public oversight and review, it's absolutely necessary in all forms of law enforcement. It is severely under-resourced. So, Mr. Sauvé, quickly, I think there's still some confusion even around this table and in the public about how the PCRC will be looking after complaints moving forward in the process. You say, you don't want police looking after, investigating police, and I get that. What you're specifically saying is you don't want the RCMP to investigate the RCMP. That's not police investigating police, right? And some of the hybrid models you talk about have law enforcement actually investigating in a hybrid model, whether they be retired or current, along with civilian investigators, and it works well. I mean, I was from Alberta. I'm very familiar with that particular process. In your estimation, and as Mr. Julian has asked, is there a process that can be changed in the legislation, more than just, we need to add more money, we need to add more resources to PCRC? Is there a process we can look at that will make it more efficient given the current legislation? What do we need to do different?
I don't know if there's changes to the legislation that can improve the process, right? So the current model as it is, using the RCMP to investigate the RCMP, which is police investigating the police, and no matter how you slice it, even if we download it to the Saskatoon PD to do the CRCC complaints, it's still police investigating the police, and the conflict is there. The way it is today with those 1,500 files, the majority of those are completed within the 30-day statutory framework.
By the RCMP.
By the RCMP.
And in reality, the majority of complaints that come into all law enforcement across this country and will be the CBSA are minor type complaints, yes. Interactions with the public, attitudes, things like that, that are in reality best suited for a resolution with the complainant, with the public, at the detachment level, at the office level. Would you agree with that?
I would agree. There's many, probably about 25% of these, right, that can be resolved informally fairly quickly, just with a phone call or an explanation.
And that's good on both sides. That's good for the public, and that's good for the officers.
Yes.
Good. Mr. Weber, I only have about a minute and a half, a minute 45 left. You described some very disturbing occurrences within the CBSA. And I share your concern. I think what you've described is an incredibly toxic environment between frontline officers and management. And I don't know how the PCRC can come in and actually fix that. I think your assessment of a cultural change at the upper management level is absolutely necessary. And I'm quite concerned that and maybe I'll let you ask the question. How do you see the PCRC coming in, and what process do you think, or how do you think it'll impact the frontline officers, the public who were here to serve and their complaints. How do you see the current legislation fixing this? And I know you will run out of time before the 5 minutes or when the 5 minutes is up, but we would really appreciate if you could give to the committee any recommendations you have after your testimony today that would help us, add strength to this legislation.
I can do that. Thank you. Quickly, if I have even 5 seconds, I think the CBSA needs to focus on not investigating absolutely everything locally. It's become an agency that does everything through formal investigation. The ability to manage or speak to employees has been abandoned at the CBSA. Everything is a formal fact finding. I think you free up a lot of resources if we get back to the way management used to happen, to actually have that interaction with employees and not formalize everything. Then you have the resources available to deal with the more important stuff. And again, allowing our officers to use the provisions of what's being proposed in C20 to bring forward their concerns and complaints as well.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. We go now to Mr. Chang. Mr. Chang, go ahead. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to all the witnesses, and thank you for joining us today. Mr. Weber, in 2017, the CRCC undertook a systemic investigation into workplace harassment in the RCMP. There is nothing stopping her for launching a similar review of the CBSA if she so chose. This was initiated by a letter from Minister Goodale. There is nothing in the bill that would limit the chairperson initiating her own review of the CBSA's culture once this bill becomes law.
That's good to know. I think that's an absolutely viable option. Yes, thank you.
And Mr. Weber, are you aware that Clause 28 of this bill, which outlines the powers that the chairperson has to initiate systemic complaints of the CBSA?
Yes, I think what's lacking is the ability of CBSA officers to bring forward complaints.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. Mr. Sauvé, one of the things that I'm interested in understanding is the interplay between the PCRC and other provincial police review and oversight agencies. For instance, the RCMP are the police of jurisdiction in Alberta. In that province, there's also the Alberta Serious Incident Response Team. What is your understanding of the different powers and jurisdiction the PCRC would have when compared to the Alberta Serious Incident Response Team?
Thank you for the question. It's completely different mandates. So, if you're a member of the RCMP in Alberta or anywhere where we provide uniform policing, and even in federal policing in Ontario or Quebec, you're subject to 3 separate oversight bodies. One being the statutory regime of civilian oversight, such as ACERT, which investigates complaints of serious harm or death when we happen to invoke use of force. So that is where a member of the RCMP could face a criminal charge. The second one, obviously, is through the RCMP Code of Conduct, which is our disciplinary regime up to and including dismissal. And the third one is the PCRC, or the future PCRC, which deals with complaints from the public. So in all of those areas, a member of the RCMP could face an investigation by ACERT, by the RCMP Professional Standards, and by the CRCC in 3 different levels, but 3 possible different results. One could result in jail time, one could result in dismissal, and the third one could result in operational or policy or changes to the RCMP itself.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sauvé. And what about data? Are there enough data? Like they have articles about data in the bill?
If you ask my staff, I'm a big proponent of data. I love data and gathering data because it tells a story. Unfortunately, in the RCMP, we haven't been consistent with gathering, whether it be race-based data or data on anything. The only thing we seem to be good about is use of force data. So I would strongly encourage the PCRC to look at exactly what Ms. Campbell was suggesting, is implementing a very, very robust system to gather any and all data that is available for interactions of law enforcement and the public or complaints processes.
Thank you, Mr. Sauvé. Ms. Campbell, this legislature will allow for the collection of race disaggregated data. Do you believe that it is important that this data be collected? And can you speak to how you would like the chairperson of PCRC to use the data? And is there space to inform systemic reviews?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chang. Yes, the data should be collected. I believe right now in the bill, it's Section 13 in the annual report that provides for data collection, but it is rather light. The RCMP has, to Mr. Sauvé's point, the RCMP has been developing a national approach to the collection and analysis of and reporting of race-based data in policing since probably about July 2020, with collaboration with the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police and Statistics Canada. That process has been slow, but it is critically important. The legislation in Alberta lacks in some areas, but it does require that for a number of street checks or officer contacts or info posts, as they're called in Calgary, that exceed the relative statistical demographics of a community, the chief of police is required to provide a reconciliation and justification to address any overrepresentation of one group, particularly for racialized and Indigenous people in the data. It's important that that data analysis and sharing occur in a distinct fashion at a community level, lest the significance of the data and analysis be diluted to just basic ineffectiveness.
Thank you, Mr. Chang. On y va maintenant, Madame Michaud. 2 minutes et demi.
2.5 minutes, please, Mrs. Michaud. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Weber, earlier when we were talking about systemic issues within a CBSA, you were talking about the importance of a culture shift. But I want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. Are you suggesting that the agents can also benefit from this commission? That is to make complaints if there's a problem with a superior or a manager, so we would understand that the commission would not only be for the public, but also for agents as well. Is this what you meant or not really?
The CBSA is that if a member or CBSA employee brings forward complaints against management, it's dealt with by management, and that's all anyone will ever hear of it. As a rule, nothing happens with anything that we put in. So I think it's really important for this commission to know exactly what's going on, so you can, look to have those kind of systemic reviews.
Je vous remercie et j'aimerais...
Thank you. I'd like to hear you speak to the status of CBSA agents as public safety officers. I believe my colleague, Mr. Julian, will ask questions on this as well, but I'm going to take this opportunity to ask a question on one of the elements you mentioned in an article in Radio-Canada. You said that you were fearful that C20 would add tension between the employer and the employee. You spoke to the worker shortage, and so when an officer is subject to a complaint, he might be on leave without pay. You said that perhaps that these delays could last several years while the complaints are being dealt with. What can you tell us about this? Are you afraid that we're going to run out of a sufficient amount of officers?
I mean, so the amount of people who are placed on leave without pay for serious allegations is not to the point where it would cause us to run out of officers. The deficit of officers that we have is something that's existed for a long time, and it is extreme. However, for those people who are placed on leave without pay pending the outcome of an investigation because the allegation is deemed to be that serious, it is life-changing and devastating to them. And I do understand that some allegations can be extremely serious, but I mean, imagine the situation that they're in where even when it's found in the end of the investigation that they've done nothing wrong, that they're told to file a grievance to get their salary back. That is not acceptable to our union at all.
Merci,
and as far as I know, that's unique to the CBSA.
Merci. Mr. Julian, please, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Well, these such good witnesses. I wish we had more time with them. But I'm going to go to Ms. Campbell. Thank you very much for your testimony today. You've spoken very eloquently about the importance of overcoming systemic racism, systemic homophobia, systemic discrimination against Indigenous women and Indigenous peoples. Does C20 address those issues in your mind? And if it doesn't yet as a bill, what are the things that need to be added to the bill, and what are the other issues that the federal government needs to start responding to so that we can start to make these sea change to overcome systemic discrimination?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Julian. Where C20 is lacking in terms of being able to address systemic racism and discrimination and the bias that is inherent is in providing the oversight body the accountability and strategic direction to set those priorities and that expectation for policing bodies and the CBSA to transform their culture. There needs to be an expectation set in some piece of legislation or regulation to enable these policing bodies to actually do the work to transform their culture and have it be measured and assessed.
And things that the federal government should be doing so that we can eliminate these barriers and eliminate this discrimination?
Well, in terms of having the data, once you've collected all this wonderful data and you've done all your reconciliations and you've done the reporting, there's who has the accountability to actually action on that data. This is where the government needs to set an expectation in some form of legislation that there is a public oversight body that has the accountability for making that transformation and actually measuring how to do it. This is the work that I'm currently tasked with doing in Calgary, and I've been a commissioner for 2.5 years and still working.
Thank you, Mr. Julian. And thank you to all of our witnesses. You've been most helpful. Thank you for sharing your time with us and your expertise. And with that, we will suspend briefly and bring in the next panel. Thank you all. Thank you all. So with us today by video conference, we have, as an individual, Mr. Mel Kapp, Professor, School of Public Policy and Governance, University of Toronto. And from the Quebec Immigration Lawyers Association, we have Ms. Perla Abou-Jaudet, my apologies, and Mr. Vincent Desbiens. We will start with each group having up to 5-minute opening statements. So we'll start with Mr. Professor Kapp. Please go ahead, sir, 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'm a former public servant. I was for 30 years in the Government of Canada, was appointed to the ranks of Deputy Minister by Prime Minister Mulroney, and then served as Clerk of the Privy Council to Prime Minister Chrétien. And I served as High Commissioner to the UK in the government of Prime Minister Stephen Harper. So nonpartisan is my middle name. I'm now a distinguished fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. En 2017, j'ai fait une étude pour le ministère de Sécurité publique sur la manque de la capacité de revue de l'Agence des services frontaliers du Canada. Et j'ai recommandé de remplir cet écart
Excuse me,
par la
sir.
création.
Excuse me.
Yep.
We're not having translation here.
Okay, well then I'll.
That's okay. We have to have translation in both languages. So,
Monsieur le Président,
pardon?
rappel au règlement.
Yes, call to order. I just wanted to be clear with all the witnesses that we encourage for them to testify in French, and if we have issues with the interpretation, they can continue in French, and we'll solve the issue. We'll solve the issue here. We're not going to ask people to change languages. It's okay. As you wish.
I believe we have interpretation once again. So, sir, if you wouldn't mind starting, start your time right from the beginning.
Sure. I made the point that I was I was not affiliated with any political party, and that I was a public servant for 30 years. I now teach at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Mais en 2017, j'ai fait.
In 2017, I did a study for the Department of Public Safety on the lack of capacity review for CBSA, and I recommended to fill this gap by creating a review commission on the agency similar to what we see in C20.
Or for the committee, a few guiding principles or objectives that members might like to keep in mind while assessing Bill C20. First is to promote the safety and security of Canada and Canadians. Second is to protect and respect the rights of Canadians. Third is to build trust and confidence in the agencies in the portfolio. Fourth is to ensure adequate accountability of these agencies, both for their actions and their management of complaints. And an alternative to what you heard from Mr. Sauvé before is I'd like to see that the responsibility is on the agency and not transferred to the Commission. Fifth, to maintain secrecy and privacy. And sixth is to protect the rights of officials that are appropriately exercising their statutory duties, as Mr. Weber pointed out. And finally, to avoid duplication and promote cooperation. There are also some constraints that I would suggest you have to decide how to balance. First, the Government of Canada does not have a mandate for all security and safety issues. There's local and provincial police as well. Not all safety and security activities, even at the federal level, fall in the mandate of the Minister of Public Safety. Building confidence and trust often is in conflict with secrecy, and we've seen that recently. Issues are not always agency specific. You need to be able to follow the thread across agencies and commissions. You must respect the complexity and difficulty of using intelligence as evidence. And good law enforcement requires good service delivery. And finally, sometimes it's about officer conduct and the exercise of authority and discretion. And sometimes, and here's the one area I think C20 could be improved, and I support the previous three witnesses, Sauvé, Campbell, and Weber, it's a problem of systemic review. An office with too many complaints or a type of complaint going beyond a particular officer may require the Commission to initiate a review. Mr. Chang in the last session appropriately pointed out that Section 28 allows the Commission to initiate reviews, but only on policy, procedure, or guidelines. And I think that could be elaborated. Je vous encourage de trouver l'équilibre optimal.
I encourage for you to find the sweet spot between these objectives and these constraints.
Holder, and I think this bill does a reasonable job at finding that balance. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have.
We go now to Ms. Perla Abou-Jaudet for the Quebec Immigration Lawyers Association. 5 minutes, please.
The association, and I'll answer the questions.
Bon matin tout le monde.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me today to appear before the committee. Acadie was founded in 1991 and brings together over 500 lawyers across Quebec who work in the specific field of immigration and refugee law. The objectives include ensuring that citizenship, refugee protection, and immigration laws and policies are drafted and applied in accordance with the principles of fairness and that they adequately meet the needs of Quebec and Canada while respecting the Constitution, the Canadian Charter, and international treaties ratified by Canada. We applaud the introduction of Bill C-20. We would like to emphasize the importance of establishing this third-party oversight of the CBSA and its employees. This is essential not only for the protection of the public, but also for the administration of sound, efficient, and transparent justice. On this last point, it is important to consider the fact that CBSA acts in many quasi-judicial proceedings at the IRB in relation to the immigration process, whether it be for detention, refugee claims, or even removal. However, the majority of IRB representatives are not lawyers. They are not subject to the same regulatory bodies and code of ethics as lawyers. Consequently, in the event of misconduct or reproachable conduct by a CBSA representative in the course of his or her duties, recourse against him or her is limited for the time being. Our members' experience in the field has taught us that this is insufficient to ensure quality control of their work and guarantee the sound administration of justice. We therefore respectfully suggest that the definition of serious incident in Section 14.1 of the CBSA Act be amended to include any incident that may interfere with the administration of justice or the proper conduct of a judicial process, and thus not limit the scope of the Act to an incident qualified as serious. We believe that this definition of a serious incident should also include any behavior that would result in a violation of rights and freedoms, including the unjustified detention or prolongation of detention of a person. Although detention does not necessarily result in serious bodily harm or death, it does cause irreparable harm, since the right to liberty and security of the person is at stake and it's violated, and there is a huge psychological impact. We note that certain provisions of Bill C-20 refer to arrest and detention by CBSA without providing a clear definition of these notions. For example, 13.2 states that the Commission's annual report shall include the number of complaints filed under this Act by persons detained by the CBSA. Section 86 stipulates that any person arrested or detained by an officer or employee of CBSA is entitled to be informed as soon as possible of his or her right to file a complaint under Part 2. The CBSA has a very restrictive definition of what constitutes arrest or detention by one of its employees. In this respect, during the mass arrival of refugees over the past few years, many asylum seekers were arrested by the RCMP after crossing the land border irregularly and were handed over to the CBSA within hours. Many remained at the border under the control of the agency for several days, in some cases more than a week, without the agency considering that they had been arrested or detained. The process for ensuring the legality of their detention under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act was not initiated for several days. This is just one example, but in our view, it's crucial to have a clear definition of the notion of detention and arrest, so that this is not left to the agency's discretion. The time limit set out in Article or Section 33 for lodging a complaint is insufficient. This is based in particular on the fact that current delays in connection with the immigration processes are often over 1 year. The current average time for an asylum claim to be heard is approximately 2 years. Our experience with our often vulnerable clientele leads us to believe that potential complainants will be afraid to go ahead with such a procedure for fear that it will have a negative impact on their chances of success, or that it might speed their removal. We've found that most decisions taken by the Commission in connection with a complaint, for example, not to investigate the complaint as provided for in Section 38 or the report on the complaint described in Section 49 in the Commission's final report, are communicated only to the complainant. We suggest that a copy should be disclosed to the complainant's legal representative. In many cases, the person may have been removed from Canada. In this eventuality, it is highly unlikely that the Commission would have access to this person's contact details. It is more likely that the legal representative would. In the same vein, it would be a good idea to allow third-party organizations to lodge complaints too. We respectfully submit that the adoption of this bill is crucial, but that appropriate changes must be made to govern the agency's conduct and policies so that the public is truly protected and justice is administered in a sound, efficient, and transparent manner.
Merci.
Thank you.
Now our rounds of questions. We'll start with Mr. Lloyd. 6 minutes, sir.
Thank you to the witnesses. I'm going to start with Professor Kapp. I think based on some research here that it's indicating that over a course of 6 years, this commission would cost about $120 million with about $19 million in funding on a go-forward basis. Do you think that is a reasonable sum of money to stand up a commission and maintain a commission like this?
Look, I spent the largest part of my career in the Treasury Board, so I should be able to answer that question. Unfortunately, I can't. I have no idea if that's enough or not. I think the discussion that you've been having around adequacy of funding is legitimate. I think you need to make sure that it is well enough funded. You're going to be carrying on the old functions of the CRCC and the new application of this law to the CBSA. So, good question. I don't have an answer.
Have this background in the civil service and Treasury Board specifically. Would you anticipate that sort of the downloading of these responsibilities that are currently taking place internally in CBSA and RCMP onto this independent review committee would lead to a better allocation of resources or even potential savings within the CBSA and RCMP that could offset some of these new costs from standing up a commission like this?
No, I do not. The point here is that, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think you have to keep the responsibility for doing these investigations on the agency. So I think CBSA has to be responsible for pursuing the complaints it receives and report to the commission that it has resolved them or not. And then the commission makes its independent judgment. If the responsibility rests only on the shoulders of the commission, then it relieves the CBSA management from treating its complaints seriously. And I think you really want to keep the burden of responsibility on the agency. And therefore, it's going to need the resources to do those investigations.
So this isn't necessarily, because one of the reasons why I felt this could be very helpful in speaking with frontline police officers is just, people make the complaints that there's too much resources going towards upper management and there's not enough resources going to frontline police officers. We do know there's a massive shortage in frontline police officer recruitment and retention. And I was hoping that this legislation could potentially mean that, some of the middle management officers or officers that are being pulled off the front line to do these administrative duties could be reallocated to the front line. But what you're saying is that it wouldn't be the case when this is implemented that these police officers would be reallocated to the front line.
Like Mr. Weber, I want the agency to be responsible for its own efficiency and for its effectiveness in delivering service. So I keep those resources in the agency.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be supporting any cuts to our front line at all. But I do want to make sure that the resources are being used most in the best manner, and we are seeing an issue at the front lines with frontline police officers not getting the resources that they need to deal with an upswing in crime and other the mental health. As one person, a mental health advocate, put to me, a tsunami of mental health issues that are coming in our country, especially in the post-COVID environment. Do you think,
Mr. Lloyd,
sorry, go ahead.
Can I just provide a quick comment on that? To
Yes.
put this in context, you have to look at the fact that this is 2015 data, and so it's more or less now. But there are over 100 million contacts a year between the public and CBSA. And of that, it generates 2,400, or in 2015 it did, 2,400 complaints. Even if it was 4 times 2,400, that's 0.001% of the contacts that lead to complaint. So, this isn't going to require massive resources.
Do you think that even just the creation of this committee will, lead to better outcomes in terms of police interactions, potentially negative interactions? Do you think even just the presence of this accountability mechanism will improve those outcomes? Or do you think that the creation of this accountability mechanism could also lead to an increase in the, vexatious and litigious complaints?
I think the answer is yes, both.
Yes.
But frankly, I think you're onto something. Look, if this system works well, there are no complaints because the agency takes it seriously and looks at the commission as a problem that it wants to avoid, and therefore it improves its performance dramatically. That's success.
Well, thank you, Professor Kapp. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Lloyd. We go now to Ms. DeMoff. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much to our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Kapp, I have a question for you about these systemic reviews. I know that when the chairperson of the CRCC appeared here in the past, she too would like the ability to do more systemic reviews. Could you maybe expand a little bit on how you think we should be changing the legislation to accommodate what you mentioned in your remarks?
Sure. Again, Mr. Chang in the last session pointed out that Section 28 allows for the Commission to initiate, but it's on a very focused set of issues, the policies and guidelines. But imagine if there's a pattern of complaint that you get a lot of complaints coming from the office in Prince Rupert. The Commission may look at this and say, well, you're missing something, agency, CBSA. You need to look at that office, and maybe there's a management problem, and then, do an investigation of that. And you want the Commission to be able to initiate those kinds of systemic reviews. In the previous session, Ms. Campbell from Calgary pointed out systemic racism. If you're going, it's something that may not occur in one office, but it might be systemically across the agency, and you want somebody to be able to draw those inferences.
Okay, thank you for that. My other question has to do with the national security. As you were doing your report, NCIRA and NSICOP were just going through the legislative process, so they didn't actually exist at the time.
Right.
but we have heard testimony or about, and we've received briefs about the necessity of this new commission of taking note of national security complaints, and also how many times they're referred to NCIRA. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you see the PRCC interacting with NCIRA, and how if there should be reporting on the referrals between the agencies.
I made the point in my opening remarks that the RCM Police and the CBSA are not the only law enforcement agencies in the government, and intelligence and security go hand in hand. So NCIRA becomes an important review commission for CSIS and other agencies like CSE. And you want the ability, and I talked about following evidence to, or turning evidence into, intelligence into evidence. You want to be able to see that work. There's nothing I see in C20 that prohibits the PRCC from connecting with NCIRA. Neither does it create a gateway. And out of precision, it would be interesting to think about specifying that those two commissions or agencies would be able to exchange information, and that would be legitimate. I don't think it's necessary. Administratively, it could be worked out, but it's something worth thinking about. The other thing is there's a whole range of other law enforcement agencies. When I was Deputy Minister of the Environment, I had the Canadian Wildlife Service under me, and those are armed officers who enforce endangered species legislation and such. This, conceivably you could encompass all of them. I don't think that's a good place to start.
Okay, thank you for that. And we've heard a lot about concerns about police investigating police. I'm assuming CBSA would be a similar situation where CBSA would be looking at CBSA to start with. Do you think this is something that is operational, or is there a legislative change that needs to be made? Or is that the way that these systems should work? I'm just wondering, given your experience on this, your opinion.
Yeah, no, I think that it's desirable that you have the agency investigating itself to improve itself. And in the first instance, and that is police investigating police. But if you then have the commission as the fallback to carry out the complaints that are not adequately reviewed, then I think that is going beyond. And then there's a question of, do you want the commission to hire current or former police officers? That's an administrative decision, and I would leave it to the commission to decide. But it obviously then does raise the question of, is this commission independent enough? I think the answer is it will be, but they'll have to pay attention to who they hire.
Thank you. And I only have a minute left. I'm sorry, I wish I had more time for the refugee lawyers, but just quickly on third-party complaints. I know you're supportive of that. It was a change that was put forward by a number of organizations. I'm just wondering if you could talk about your role in initiating those kind of complaints, and if you do have any suggestions to improve the bill before us.
So by permitting the third-party complaints, it will permit actually to answer the Article 28 and permit the Commission to do its own reviews when we, on the experience in the field, when we have complaints from many claimants. At that point, we could also raise that issue to the agency or to the Commission. So we already try and do it on the field. So the different organization, our organization, Legal Aid, when we have access to detainees, it's way easier for us to raise an issue, a general issue that's systemic, that we see every time, instead of having every claimant do it to the Commission. And then it would also alleviate the work of the Commission and help to improve the situation without personally putting one claimant that is generally scared and vulnerable to do a complaint against what just happened.
Merci, madame.
Thank you.
C'est maintenant, madame.
Mrs. Michaud, 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your presence. I'm going to continue in the same vein as Ms. Damoff. Thank you for your comments, and I imagine that you have worked a lot in the past with immigrants who are at the Immigration Surveillance Center under CBSA, and that as a group you would have liked to be able to accompany a complainant in a process for a complaint or to do it in their stead, as Section 38 that you mentioned would allow it, and you say that you're in agreement. Could you talk about the benefits that this could have for the people in these types of situations? Yes, in some situations, with some people, they're not able to understand exactly what is happening or how to go through the process. So by allowing a third person or a third party to help them, once again, this would allow to facilitate the task of the Commission, but also to have a faster response. But also, depending on the situations, the agency has a discretionary power that is very huge. The standard is that things generally go well, but we do find unjust situations and situations that should be highlighted and that we try to bring forth. In the detention centers, they have a very limited access to the outside. Mainly, they're dealing with their lawyer. They have access to their family. Sometimes it's limited as well. By allowing a third party or an organization or our association to also be able to raise issues, this would absolutely facilitate the task. Thank you. And your colleague referred to some sections quickly. I'm not sure if it will be possible to have the list of changes that you're proposing. Perhaps we can have a further discussion if something had to be amended in this bill, and where you would concentrate your efforts or what recommendations you're making to the committee. Unfortunately, we didn't have the time to submit something in writing, and we could work on this and do it at a later date. We believe that the definitions are too vague, as mentioned in our speaking notes, and the definitions are too vague for us to be able, or rather for the Commission, to have a greater amount of power to be able to investigate on different issues. As mentioned, we're talking about as mentioned by my colleague, the definition of detention is defined by CBSA when there's a detention or arrest, and without any clear and specific definition, this does create a problem. But we will send you a document in writing after this meeting with regards to different sections. Thank you. Now, with regards to definitions that are too vague, perhaps there are some concerns with regards to Section 33, where it says that complaints should be made with the new commission 1 year after the event. This could be extended if there are valid reasons, and it's not against public interest. In the bill, it is not defined what a good reason is or what public interest is. Do you agree? Perhaps this should be better defined to explain what would be in the public interest, why there should be an extension, what could be a valid reason. It seems quite vague in the wording. Do you agree with me? Yes, absolutely. We think that this should also include policies of the agency. So by allowing individuals and entities to do it. Thank you. I'm not sure if you had the opportunity to listen to Mr. Weber, who was representing the the employees of the CBSA union, and he was speaking to a systemic issue within the agency, and that it should not be only one officer targeted by a complaint, but perhaps a culture change is necessary. In the cases that you've seen with immigrants or people that you've accompanied who have experienced prejudice, do you see that there might be a broader problem rather than one action by one officer or agent? Yes. Oftentimes, decisions are made. I'm going to give a simple example. It happened to someone who decided to stop a person even before the date of the removal. The supervisor might say, oh, no, we agree with the decision made by the agent. So there's no follow-up. We agree with what Mr. Weber is saying with regards to the organizational culture. We can't speak to what agents are doing with regards to their administration, but in the detention, when we ask for documents, we ask for proof, and it's very difficult to obtain things ahead of time as required by the law. We try to highlight these different issues to the administration. Sometimes it's very well appreciated, sometimes it's not. So we think that it will be essential to make a change at all levels. If you'll allow me to add something, this is why we believe that third parties should be able to lodge complaints. We are witnesses to these issues, these cultural issues, but the client may not always want to denounce the entire situation because it's their file. So this would allow a change within the organizational culture in a broader level, and the client is vulnerable. They're asking asylum. They don't want this to have an impact on their file, and then they have to find housing, social assistance. Their family is there, and so to lodge a complaint, well, maybe that is the last of their concerns, but their lawyer could go forward and could go forward with the complaint, that the client might not want to do this, might not want to add this to all the problems that they're experiencing in their distress.
Merci.
Thank you.
And I would suggest to witnesses that the committee would certainly welcome any written submissions for recommendations you might have. As a matter of practicality, I would urge that they be received by us within the next week so that we could take appropriate action. And we'll go now to Mr. Julian. Mr. Julian, go ahead, please, 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et merci.
Thank you, and thank you to our witnesses. Thank you for this important testimony. I'm going to begin with you, Mr. Kapp, and thank you for your service to the country. I have two questions.
Board. How did you evaluate the process of resources? Because this is something that has come back up systematically, that the resources that are being allocated by the federal government seem to fall woefully short of what is actually required. This is anecdotally, right? So the question is, on Treasury Board, how would you have evaluated the appropriateness of a budget, and what would be the criteria that you would have used?
Well, Mr. Julian, I'm tempted to tell you that it was magic, but I know that won't suffice. I think there were criteria that were applied where you look at the demand and you think about what supply is required. And each of the departments have to then justify the resources. So in this case, you would expect that CBSA will go to the Treasury Board Secretariat, who then will take it to the Treasury Board of Ministers, and look at the kind of requirements in terms of what kind of demand there will be. I said in answering Mr. Lloyd that I hope that there were no complaints because the agency would adapt and do a better job. I know that's not going to happen to zero, but you would come to a judgment about how many complaints, how many would require investigation, how much staff would be required to do the investigation, and then make sure that you had enough people at the border to keep service quality high. one of the things that is required in this is the agencies to establish service standards. And you really want to see the agency saying, here's how we will respond to your complaints. And Mr. Sauvé in the previous panel talked about how many of the complaints were resolved within 30 days. That shows that the RCM police, at least, have a standard, and that would be used in going to the Treasury Board for resources.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, it's quite clear, given the figures that we know anecdotally now, the size and scope of the existing workload and the fact that there are additional workload to do this properly. I think it's pretty clear to me that we are falling woefully short. But thank you for your answer. I wanted to ask you a follow-up question where you said that if the Commission does its work well, hopefully, for example, the CBSA, the management will take their work seriously. Can you give us any examples of oversight where we have seen that kind of management taking it seriously reform that has led to fewer complaints?
Nothing comes to mind, I'm afraid. I think the principles of machinery of government and accountability point to the problem of offloading that responsibility. And there are examples, and none come to mind at the moment, of where an agency that was having oversight. So I make a distinction between review and oversight. Review is ex post, oversight is in real time. And when you second guess the agency, you change the behavioral response of the agents. And what you don't want is for the agents to think, I don't have to take this seriously. I know, when I was a junior officer,
I'm sorry to cut you off. I've got some other questions. Merci. Je vais passer maintenant à...
Thank you, Mr. Desbiens. Thank you for your service, first of all, in helping people who oftentimes have no other options. You spoke to the capacity of a third party to lodge a complaint. Everyone around this table sees that it's quite clear that that is a huge change that should be brought to the bill. Are you also concerned by the fact that the Commission can quite easily reject complaints on several different grounds? And what do you think of this bill to combat discrimination and systemic racism? We've been talking about this for several days now with regards to this bill. Yes. Our association, Acadie, is concerned. It's very easy to reject a complaint and to say, oh, no, it's not really linked to the behavior of an agent. It's linked to a policy or something like that. The fact that the Commission, in the terms used in the Act, it says that has to refuse, by simplifying the situation, it says could refuse a complaint. This would alleviate concerns and give greater flexibility to the Commission to see if it's necessary to receive the complaint or not, and then go through the different steps. Perhaps my colleague has something to add. I don't have anything to add, no. If there are anything else that comes to mind, we will add it in our submitted brief.
So we're running a little short of time. I think we will have time to do a shortened second round as we did last time, but we will go over maybe 5 minutes. Is the committee okay with that? Yeah, okay. In that case, we will begin with Mr. Shipley. Mr. Shipley, go ahead, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the witnesses for being here today. My first question is going to be for Mr. Kapp. Mr. Kapp, first of all, thank you for your long and distinguished service to Canada. I want to ask you a little bit of a personal question, if I may. Back in 2017, you recommended an external oversight body for both the CBSA and RCMP. That's 6 years ago. Are you feeling a little bit frustrated or disappointed being testifying here today that this is our third attempt at passing this bill since you made those recommendations?
I'm sure I am less frustrated than you are, sir. The only point I would make is that Ms. Damhoff made reference to NSIRA and NCCOP. I think those were more important, quite frankly.
Okay. Well, and thank you for being here today. Pleasure. So in regards to that, in 2017, you were asked by the then Minister of Public Safety, Mr. Goodale, to conduct a report on federal policing oversight in Canada. Would you say C20 in its current form aligns with the recommendations you provided in that report?
I would say it largely does. There's small points that I would do slightly differently, but the only thing that I see as a gap is that a point about the commission instituting new reviews.
Okay. So specifically then, is there anything else missing from the legislation that you would have liked to see, given your experience reviewing law enforcement?
Not really. I think I'm assuming this is not the last time that Parliament will deal with this, and that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you'll be able to assess, has this been good and what's missing.
You made me a little nervous there when you said the last time we're dealing with it. I hope it's the last time as a bill we're dealing with it. We don't go on to number 4, but let's keep our our fingers crossed. So a couple of quick questions. Thank you for those answers. A couple of questions for the immigration lawyers. First of all, either one can jump in on this one. The National Police Federation has shared concerns that the current complaint process effectively leads to police investigating themselves. Do you share these concerns?
I don't think that it would be efficient. From what we see on the field, I don't think it would be efficient. I don't think our association has a global point of view about that. But on the field, it's hard to complain about a coworker, and it's going to be even harder, we think, to see it of a different point of view.
And did your fellow lawyer have anything to add to that, or?
Oui, c'est sûr que y a tout aussi la perspective.
Yes, there's the perspective of the complainant. These are vulnerable people. Oftentimes they might come from countries where authorities represent as something negative. So for the complainant, to complain to a superior, which represents, again, an authoritative figure linked to the person who caused prejudice, well, it's very difficult for them, and it causes hardship. For me, it would not allow to have a process that's sufficient for the complainants.
Thank you. And do either one of you have an opinion on the removal of the judicial review clause from this bill?
Could you tell us which article you're referring to? Sorry.
I don't have that right in front of me, and I don't have my staff 2 feet behind me, but there was in place in past an opportunity for, if information wasn't brought forward, that you could go to a judicial review and ask for them to review to have that released.
We would definitely encourage it. I'm sorry, I'm not sure of where it is in the law, in the project, but we definitely encourage that there's a judicial review possible, because it is more than important, and the agency has a lot of discretion. Project S8 also gave them even more power, and we don't have access to judicial review. So we think judicial review is really, really important to be able to catch up the cases that falls into cracks.
Okay, thank you for that. Maybe just going back to Mr. Kapp, I think I only got about 30 seconds left, so a short answer on this, Mr. Kapp. Would you like to see any type of an information campaign or a code of conduct for CBSA officers alongside Bill C-20 so they can have absolute clarity on their obligations, such as informing individuals of their right to file a complaint under this legislation?
I think that's possible and probably desirable, but it's an administrative decision of the agency. I wouldn't put it in the law.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Shipley.
witnesses.
We go now to Mr. Nur Mohammed. Go ahead, sir. 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I'd like to thank all the witnesses. Mr. Kapp, it's a pleasure to see you again after so many years. I'm going to begin with a question from Mrs. Aboujaoud. Chaudet. One of the main things that we hope to fix the concern of many communities who don't have recourse or a way to lodge a complaint with negative experiences with CBSA officers when there's a perception of discrimination. I'm trying to specify here that it's not the case in the large majority of cases, but when it does exist, would you agree to say that this bill will help? Do you think it will provide more guarantee to communities that they will have this recourse? And how can we make sure that those who are working on the front lines are part of the solution? So if I'm understanding what you're asking, I believe that this bill is an excellent step. It allows third parties the opportunity to lodge complaints. This would help cultural communities to say, okay, we had such and such a problem, and a complaint might be lodged individually, but if it is highlighted on several occasions with regards to organizations such as ours, with discussions that are held between our members, generally speaking, we can see if there's a specific issue that is being raised, whether it be at an office, at a location, and it's easier for an organization such as ours to lodge a complaint and to highlight the different problems. And we think that this would help improve access and would help to increase impartiality, but also to have access to lodging a complaint. In your opinion, what is stopping members from different communities to feel comfortable in lodging a complaint against public safety officers, and why? Could you speak a little bit more to this? Why is the role of a third party so important? CBSA, well, I'm going to speak only of a case of a person who was asking for asylum and it was refused. The officer has the obligation to remove the person as quickly as possible. Whether or not we lodge a complaint, well, this could flag the issue in the file and push the officer to say, oh, well, the file is ready, and so we're going to send it. So just that does put pressure on the person to not lodge a complaint. So if an issue is raised and a third party is able to bring this to the administration and to a commission, if nothing is done, this in and of itself would increase access. This is a very simple example, but it's something that happens frequently. Thank you.
Nodding as the previous witness was speaking. When it comes to this issue of being able to bridge the gap between communities feeling safe and officers feeling like they're part of the solution, what do you think, along with this law, what are some of the things that you think need to happen to ensure that not just the letter but the spirit of the law actually sees itself manifesting at the front lines?
I'd come back to something Mr. Shipley raised. I mean, should the agency make it clear to people that they have the right to complain? I think the answer is yes. But also, there's an outreach from the agency to those communities that should be undertaken. And we've seen this. CSIS has a consultative forum with some minority communities, and it's something that builds trust and confidence. And we go back to those first principles. Anything that will build trust and confidence, I think, is a good thing.
Mr. Chair, how much time do I have left?
18 seconds.
I will yield that time back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nur Mohammed. On y va maintenant, Madame Michaud.
Mrs. Michaud, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kapp, I know that you have government experience that is quite extensive, and I'm wondering what you think of the fact that over 20 years now, it was recommended to the government to create an independent organization. An independent organization, Justice O'Connor had recommended the creation of an independent process to manage public complaints following a public investigation that garnered a lot of media attention in 2020. Also, the Privacy Commissioner spoke to the importance of privacy in searches. Also, it was recommended to have an independent processing process for complaints. Do you think it's taken too long for the government to act? We know that this is take 3. In the 2 prior legislatures, they tried to introduce similar legislation. It was never a priority, so these died on the order paper. Do you think that the process was too long? And do you think that it was high time to reestablish confidence, public confidence, towards the RCMP and CBSA, two public safety organizations that have have experienced bad media? I'm not blaming the agencies. Each case is different, and there was negative media coverage. So was it important for the government to have more transparency and to reestablish trust, public trust? I'm not surprised that it's taken all this time. However, as I responded to Mr. Shipley, I think that the other initiatives were more important. So I understand what has happened, but the question now of building trust among the public, this is at the heart of all these initiatives. And I don't know how to create this, but in any case, it is extremely important. Thank you so much. I think everyone agrees to congratulate the government for this initiative. I think there's a lot of positive elements in C20. Are you fearing, as other people have testified, that there is an efficient amount of funding, and this could lead to delays and a lengthy process that could discourage people from sticking with the process? I hesitate to answer because I haven't yet studied the issue of adequate resources or adequate funding, so I don't have an opinion on that. We would have to come back to the objectives of the agency. They deal with, there are nearly 100 legislative initiatives. There's wildlife, there's fisheries and oceans, there's agriculture, there's so many things. So this is much more complex than we think. And there are 30 million commercial transactions. And so this requires resources to do an adequate job. Thank you.
I was asleep at the switch.
Oui,
I'll let that go on.
elle a eu 4 minutes. Presque 5.
Go ahead, sir. Last word.
She had almost 5 minutes, and I want the same. No, that's okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to come back to Mr. Desbiens and Mrs. Joady. We're talking about a commission comprised of 5 people. What criteria should be used in order to make sure that we have a commission that is doing work attentive to the needs of people? What types of people would you like to see appointed to this commission? Honestly, we did not look at that, and so we cannot provide an answer. I think it's an issue of competencies, of openness of mind. We need people also coming from different cultural communities. That would be helpful. Perhaps people with a background in the agency. to be able to reflect the reality of the agency. So I think that if there's a certain diversity that would be useful, it would be helpful.
Je ne sais pas si tu as quelque chose à ajouter.
Vincent, I don't know if you have something to add. No, we hadn't really turned our mind to this. We're taking notes on questions that we don't have answers for, and we might add this in our submitted brief. But do you think there should be at least one person with experience with people who are seeking asylum? Do you think this might be an important element for the Commission? Yes, we need people with experience, whether it be within organizations dealing with asylum seekers' files, who has experience dealing with vulnerable populations, perhaps lawyers practicing in the field of representing this type of clientele. It's important to understand the reality and also to understand what they have experienced. So yes, I think that we're going to have people that have a personal lived experience. Mr. Kapp, the same question for yourself. Who do you think should sit on this commission? What type of people can do this work required by this new commission? I don't have an easy answer to that, but
I should tell you that I ended my report to the government on this issue by underscoring the importance of the quality of the people they appointed. I don't have the model in mind, but I would say an indolent, too relaxed chairman would not be helpful. Somebody who takes this seriously, perhaps has a background in law or law enforcement, but not necessarily. A member of the public could do this very well. In any case, I think the quality of the people is hugely important.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Julian. And thank you to our witnesses. That wraps up our meeting for today. I appreciate your time and your expertise. And looking forward to your briefs and hopefully within the next week as a matter of practicality. Thank you all, and we are now adjourned.
Thank you.
Merci, bonne journée.